Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 10th of July of 2023. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And first we're going to start with Orechov with Bradley Square. As one of my friend told me, the Bradley Square is increasing, and currently this is a very big field of, it's not just a field, it's cemetery of destroyed Ukrainian armored vehicles. Today, during the day, the Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to attack Robotyno. They were attacking the settlement from the west. They were attacking, trying to penetrate the Russians' defense belt in front of this settlement. They were attacking this, trying to attack the settlement from the east. All those attempts were repelled. The Ukrainians had significant losses. They lost a lot of armored vehicles, a lot of infantry, and during the day, almost every single second hour, the Russians published another video of destroyed Ukrainian armored vehicles. And for the first, let's say on this video, you can see how the Ukrainians were trying to land their troopers and to move their personal armored carriers as close as possible to the combat line, but at some minutes we see that something went wrong and one of the personal carrier got on the minefield and was destroyed. And right after it, the second personal armored carrier was destroyed by the Russian tank. They were trying to land the troopers, but they were destroyed. Basically, the Russians are saying that during that attempt, particularly that attempt, the attack involved around 2 tanks and 3 armored personal carriers, and the Russians are saying that they managed to the Russians managed to destroy during that attack 2 tanks and 3 personal armored carriers, but on this video we saw the destroy of just 2 personal carriers. Also, there was another picture without any video confirmations, just a picture with some descriptions that, for example, on another part of the front line, the Ukrainians launched attack using 4 Bradleys plus infantry. As a result of artillery duels, as a result of attacks from the Russian side, the Ukrainians lost 1 personal carrier and the infantry were forced to step back and to move to the forest lines. The rest of the 3 machines, 3 armored vehicles, were able to retreat and were able to step back from that area. Also, there was another video a little bit later that from eastern flank, or maybe from the western flank, the Ukrainians made another attempt. During that attack, the Ukrainians were using 7 Bradleys, 1 tank with demining equipment and 1 tank support tank. As a result of fierce fightings, the Ukrainians lost the tank with demining equipment, and after that most of the armored vehicles took a decision to turn and start retreating, and they got onto minefields, and around 5 Bradley armored vehicles got on minefields and were destroyed. On this video we see how the Ukrainians tanks were trying to retreat, to step back. The Russians followed them and they were waiting for them when these tanks will stop or will slow down, and as soon as the Ukrainians slow down or maybe stop, the Russians attack those tanks in their back, and one of those tanks was damaged during that operation. As you can see, the situation of today, of the 10th of July, reminds me the situation of the 4th of June, 4th, 5th and 6th of June, when the Ukrainians launched massive suicide operation, and today was one of those suicide operation that we can count of Ukrainian military history. When talking about Petykhatki, let's discuss a little bit the western flank of Bradley Square. There were no updates during the day. The Ukrainians continue regrouping. Just the sources reported that Ukrainians managed to accumulate and collect the rest of 128th Brigade that was moved from the combat line. They managed to create a small squad or maybe a few platoons, and they attacked the Russian positions with the rest that left from 128th. Of course, those forces were defeated, and the Ukrainians, having significant losses, were forced to step back towards Stepov and Lapkova. The Ukrainians from their side published another video of a swarm drone attack, of usage of tactic of drone swarm. Basically, I'm using this video for geolocation because, as you can see, I had, at least from my side, there were a lot of questions about exactly particularly this bridgehead on the south of Kupyansk, because since the beginning of the special military operation I haven't seen a real video or photo confirmations that exactly this part of the settlement is under Russian control, but basically the video of drone attack against the radar in this area confirms that this part of Kupyansk is under complete Russian control. Now we are moving one more time through Orekhov. The Russian Ministry of Defense reported they destroyed the command center of 47th Brigade, but haven't provided us any video. And when talking about Vremyevka, the Ukrainians and either the Russians and the Ukrainians took a small operational pause after fierce fightings in the fields between Novodarivka, Livadne, Priyutino and Rovnopol. Both sides took a decision to make a small operational pause, and the Ukrainians changed their tactics, and currently they're trying to attack the Russians using the swarm drone tactics. They're trying to discover the Russian positions, their tanks, and they try to destroy them. At least particularly on this video we see how the Ukrainians were trying to destroy Russian tanks somewhere in the fields, and according to this video we see that they needed at least 2 attempts to do this, and maybe just from the second attempt they managed to destroy the Russian tank that maybe was even broken and was left by the Russians somewhere among the fields of Vremyevka tactical bridgehead. We haven't received any updates about Ugledar, probably also after fierce fightings in the residential area in the vicinity of the settlement. Both sides took a decision to make a small operational pause, and the Russians, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, reported that the entire losses of the Ukrainians from Petykhatki to Ugledar were around 150 soldiers, 7 armored vehicles and 2 artillery systems D-20. And all the losses on the Bradley Square that took place today weren't included in this report. The numbers of report I've just provided you includes the losses just for the previous 24 hours without the loss of the Ukrainians for today. We expect significant number of Ukrainian losses tomorrow, and it's very interesting to hear because we want to hear the real numbers of the losses of the Ukrainians on the Bradley Square. Now we're moving to Avdiivka, to Donetsk front line. We got a lot of very interesting updates from this bridgehead. The Ukrainians are in panic. They're in a real panic. Today the Ukrainians made another attempt to attack the Russians in the vicinity of Vadiane and in the vicinity of Opotna. To tell the truth, the Ukrainians don't care where to attack. They don't care where to attack, they care just about the purpose. Currently, the Ukrainians in Avdiivka appeared in operational encirclement. Also, the Ukrainians were attacking in direction of Krasnogorovka. All those attacks were repelled by the Russians. And the thing is that, for example, today, some soldiers on the ground, some officers on the ground reported that during the previous weeks, because of clashes on the South Donetsk and Zaporozhye area, and because of very high intensifying in this area, the Russians have accumulated significant number of artillery systems exactly in the vicinity of Donetsk. And of course, we remember that during the previous weeks, the Ukrainians bombed a lot the warehouses and ammo depots of the Russians in Makiivka. We remember those explosions. And basically, currently, the Russians have superiority in artillery systems on Avdiivka front line, and some of these artillery systems are used in Zaporozhye area, and some of them are located in Donetsk, like to have like a normal strategical reserves for rotation. And basically, the Russians took a decision not to waste the artillery systems for nothing, and they started bombing and shelling the roads and area, the supply roads between Avdiivka and the mainland. And today the Russians published the video how they were tracking and discovering the Ukrainian armored vehicles, light vehicles, like just the regular trucks on the roads between Orlovka, Berdichi, Avdiivka, Semenovka, between all these small settlements among these fields. And the Russians destroyed a lot of dozens of vehicles have already destroyed dozens of armored vehicles on this front line. And basically, I'll repeat the words of the officer on the ground in this territory, that Avdiivka currently is in operational encirclement. The Russians managed to suppress the Ukrainian artillery systems, particularly on this front line, and currently the Russians don't have problems at all to follow and to destroy Ukrainian armored vehicles and any type of vehicles that moves along these small lines between Avdiivka and the mainland. And this is the reason why the Ukrainians try to attack the Russians to the north in direction of Krasnogorovka and Vesele, and then to the south in direction of Vodiane and Opytne. The tactic that the Ukrainians try to use is to stretch Russian forces. Of course, we understand that the Russians are forced to stretch their forces like along this red line, and for example, if they need to operate the reserves, and if the Ukrainians attack Krasnogorovka, the Russians, let's say, need to send the reserves first in this direction, then the Ukrainians can step back and immediately launched another attack to the south, and this situation forced the Russians to redeploy their forces to the south. And of course, all these movements, all these redeployments are tracked by the Ukrainian drones, by the Ukrainian intelligence services. They're trying to pin down and to destroy Russian convoys during these movements. So this operation is not so easy for the Russians. From one side, we see the benefits that that Avdiivka is an operational encirclement, but from the other side, we see that the Ukrainians also try to get as much as possible benefits from this situation by stretching Russian reserves and trying to catch them and to destroy them also on the march, on the convoys, and so on. This situation is very difficult, but anyway, as I see, this situation is plays in Russian favor, and the reason of that is that Avdiivka, no matter the Ukrainian successful operation during the previous days, is in operational encirclement. Now we're moving further to Artyomovsk area. Today we also got a lot of updates from the Battle of Klishchiivka. The Russians reported that they destroyed the ammo depot of 24th Mechanized Brigade in the vicinity of Toretsk, and I'll remind you that the forces of 28th Mechanized and 24th Mechanized Brigade are the main forces who currently try to storm the Russian positions between Mayorsk and Azaryanovka. Currently, for now, all the Ukrainian attempts were repelled by the Russians, and today the Russian soldiers, the Russian forces in the vicinity of Mayorsk published significant video of very high quality that describe us the situation, the battle of the southern of Gorlovka, of Mayorsk, of the southern flank of Artyomovsk, and basically on this video we can calculate up to dozen of Ukrainian armored vehicles that were destroyed during the previous day's offensive operation. It's of course it's terrible video that the Ukrainians don't have any protection based on these results. They don't have any support of intelligence. Basically the Russians were cracking all these armored vehicles like just a small nuts on the table. It's terrible video for the Ukrainians, and of course significant result of Russian intelligence and Russian forces. Another video was published from the vicinity of Klishchiivka, another video how the Russians were tracking, discovering the Ukrainians' offensive forces, how they were bombing them and destroying them during the movements along the forest lines, along the trenches, and so on. As we know, currently we haven't received significant videos and clashes from Klishchiivka itself. The Russians, I'll remind you, have redeployed the Akhmat special unit in direction of Klishchiivka to reinforce this area, and of course it will reduce the Ukrainian chances to get any success in this territory, because of not just because of special in Akhmat, but because of the fact that the Russians see the problem, see the situation, and they send more and more reserves to hold this territory, and the Russians, as I understand, are not going to step back from Klishchiivka at all. The Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to attack the Russians in the vicinity of Berkhovka and on the northern flank of Artyomovsk, and some sources are saying that the Ukrainians managed to penetrate the Russians' defense belt and to enter Berkhovka itself. There was, we discussed the situation, there was a video how the Ukrainians entered this part of the settlement, and there was a video how the Russians made the clearing operation. For now, it doesn't matter, to tell the truth, the results of the battle, because even if the Ukrainians managed to enter Berkhovka, these results are so small in comparison with the entire picture. And basically some sources are saying, some military analytics are saying that the main purpose of attack in direction of Berkhovka and Yagidne, as we discussed, the first one is to attack the Artyomovsk from Khromova. This is the first goal of that operation, and the second one is to attack Berkhovka and to get the road that connects Artyomovsk and Slaviansk, and basically by this operation to cut the Russian Russian forces who currently have bridgehead in their positions in Dubovo-Vasilievka, and basically the most important among these trenches, among this forest line, among this forest on the western part of this bridgehead, because this area, this one I'll show you on the map, this one is the real headache for the Ukrainians. They don't know for sure how to penetrate this area, how to force the Russians to step back. There are very rich quality, rich level, rich developed network of trenches. There is a forest line, there is a real forest, there are hills in this area, there is a normal supply and support, and currently the Ukrainians don't have possibilities how to push the Russians from this territory. And by attacking in direction of Berkhovka, the Ukrainians, maybe their military experts and their generals, took a decision by that operation to cut the Russians in Dubovo-Vasilievka and to encircle them. But for now, the Ukrainians haven't managed to achieve success, maybe even at all. The Ukrainians continue counter-artillery duels, and on this video, the Ukrainians claims that during these days of clashes for the northern flank of Artyomovsk, they managed to destroy 2 D-30 howitzers in the vicinity of Paraskovievka and Krasnaya Gora. The Russian military expert Ryber provided his own analysis of this situation, and basically, and this is a very interesting piece of information that we will discuss during the video, that after small operational pause, after the Ukrainians were defeated in the vicinity of Klishchiivka, Kurdyumovka, Zaryanovka and Berkhovka, the Ukrainians moved their forces for regrouping, and currently they have already prepared around 21 storming squads. The number of soldiers in each squad is around 120 soldiers. 12 of those storm squads will the Ukrainians will try to use in the vicinity of Klishchiivka, and 9 of those squads, mainly that's created from the 57th Brigade, will try to continue their advancing in direction of Berkhovka, so on the northern flank. So that means that currently the Ukrainians have around a little bit less than 3,000 soldiers have prepared after rotation, after the first wave of clashes in Klishchiivka, who are ready to continue offensive operation in Klishchiivka and Dubovo-Vasilievka, Berkhovka. Around 3,000 soldiers. A lot of interesting updates are coming from Siversk bridgehead. The most important one, as I understand, that according to the Ryber, the blogger, the Ukrainians have redeployed 92nd Mechanized Brigade to the south in direction of Razdolovka to reinforce the force of 10 Mountain Assault Brigade. This is a very weird update because the recent piece of news that we got from Kupyansk frontline told us that 92nd Mechanized Brigade was completely defeated and destroyed during the previous clashes. But now we're having another type of information where we see that maybe this brigade wasn't defeated but just was removed to the south to reinforce the Ukrainians in the vicinity of Razdolovka to Sporne. The Ukrainians continue publishing the video how they were bombing and shelling the Russians along these railroad ways, and if you follow the channel, we see during the previous weeks, we've seen a lot of videos exactly, particularly from these railroad ways, and how the forces of 10th Mountain Assault Brigade were bombing and shelling the Russian positions in this area. And the question is, what is the purpose of the Russians? Why they're not retreating from this bridgehead? Why the Russians try to hold this territory, and why they're not stepping back? Because from this perspective, we don't see any value of these railroad ways. So why the Russians are there? And we can find the answer in the small settlement by the name of Sporne. Currently, the Russians are storming the settlement from the north, and there were updates that the Russians managed to capture part of this forest and the forest line on the top of this settlement, and also the Russians are trying to advance on the south. So basically there is a storming operation of Sporne, the Russian attack from the north, from the south, and basically these fields are under Ukrainian control, and the reason why the Russians have entered and tried to advance along these railroad ways is, one, to secure the flanks, to establish fire control, every type of control they can among these fields, and just to secure the Russian flanks on the south of Sporne, and not to allow the Ukrainians to attack the Russian army in the flank while attacking in Sporne. So This is my vision of the situation. As I understand, this is the purpose of this suicide mission along the railroad ways from the Russian side. But as we can see, the Russians still haven't captured Sporne, so we can't tell for sure how long the Russians need to hold this forest line and how long they need to continue to die under Ukrainian drones attack. When talking about Sporne, as we see, the Russians have developed, brushed it from the south, from the north. As I understand, at least we haven't received real updates that the Russians managed to clear the entire forest. So basically, according to this configuration, there is still a risk to being attacked by the Ukrainian side in direction of this forest, that can force the Russians to step back towards the Lysychansk oil refinery. But I think that the Russians have calculated and everything, and I do really expect that maybe in a day or two, and maybe by the end of this week, the Russians will capture the settlement, and then they will maintain the combat line, and then they will proceed further in direction of Razdolovka and Veselaya from the north. This is a very important area. We haven't received any updates about Belogorovka, and the Russians, the Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation, reported that the entire total losses of the Ukrainians from Mariinka to, let's say, Belogorovka, this is Donetsk front line, were around 275 soldiers from the Ukrainian side, 5 armored vehicles, including 1 tank. Very fierce fightings continue in the vicinity of Dibrova and Toretsk in this square. As you can see, most of the mappers finally have updated their maps, showing that these edge positions in the forest is currently under Russian control. So the Russians have a little bit pushed the Ukrainians from the western part of Dibrova and from the southern positions of the road between Toretsk and Kremenaya. So the Ukrainians published another video how they destroyed and bombed the Russian tanks that were heading to the combat line. This video is geolocated. But another interesting analysis we got from Rybar, from military expert of Russia. He reported that when talking particularly about this area, the Ukrainians have already accumulated also around 3,000 soldiers, stormtroopers, for the next offensive operation. So, one more time. On the southern flank in the Artyomovsk, in this area, the Ukrainians have accumulated around 3,000 soldiers. The Ukrainians have accumulated around 3,000 soldiers on Seversk Lyman front line, of course for offensive purposes. And there was another analysis from the same expert that the Ukrainians have accumulated another 3,000 soldiers, a little bit less, on the Kupyansk front line. So the Ukrainians have completed their preparation before the next wave of offensive operation, and based on this piece of information, we understand that Ukrainians will attack on the Kupyansk front line, on Toretsk bridgehead, and probably in Artyomovsk or Bakhmut. Or they attack there right now, and maybe they will continue doing this and the next week as well. The Ministry of Defense of Russian Federation reported that when talking about Kupyansk and Lyman front line, the Ukrainians lost around 150 soldiers and 9 armored vehicles. So the level of losses when calculate these two front lines are very high. Well, that's it about the ground situation, I believe. So just also another video from the Kupyansk front line. The Russian claims that they destroyed another howitzer M777 that the Ukrainians were used to support their forces during the Battle of Novoselovska, that Ukrainians have lost recently. And this howitzer was destroyed by counter-artillery duel. And let's finish the situation on the ground with Kherson area. Today, the Russians, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians made a very powerful artillery strike using daggers, Kinzhal missiles, and Iskander missiles against the positions of the Ukrainian forces in the vicinity of Nikolaev airport. The level of losses is very heavy on this area, and the Ukrainian sources are saying that after that strike, the Ukrainians in the settlements like Nikolaev, Odessa were forced to report about urgent blood collecting procedures. They start asking people to come as soon as possible to hospitals and to give their blood for the wounded soldiers and people during that attack in Nikolaev airport. Another video from Chernobyevka airport in the vicinity of Kherson. The Russians destroyed another M777 howitzer that Ukrainians were using to supply and support their Ukrainian landing operation in the vicinity of Antonov Bridge. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds to condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.